Welcome to Merschman Seeds Cup of Joe. On this episode, the USDA report came out Thursday. Hear what Turk has to say. What could be the cause of soybeans yellowing this time of year? We discuss several soybean diseases and why it's important to choose the correct variety for your field.
Hi, this is Joe Merschman. Welcome to Merschman Seeds Cup of Joe. Today we have Turk and Ben. And Turk, well, we start with you this time first. Give Ben a break.
Big news in the market this week, Joe, was the USDA report come out. Corn yields are estimated to be down 5 bushels from the last report and 3 bushels below the average trade guess. So fireworks in the corn market from this report. Bean market was kind of neutral, but China come in and started buying a bunch of beans this week. They must have finally figured out that we have some problems over here, or they're getting nervous or whatever, but they're coming in and buying soybeans, so the soybean market is kind of moving up as well. So good things. Basically, the weather that we have from here on out is going to determine whether we continue to move these yields down, or they stabilize, or they start going the other way. I was in western Iowa this week, and the corn was amazing looking out there. I mean, everywhere I looked, there's been some rains kind of roll through here. Drought monitor is still saying very little or no improvement. So kind of the same old thing there. We need to continue to get some rains. There is really no reason for this market to go down at this point that I can see. We're probably going to go up and possibly test new highs again at some point before we always go down into that market, or into that harvest market. So
what's the typical low for the year? I mean, the traditional low for the year is what, Columbus Day?
Columbus Day.
That's
for
in
soybeans.
October.
For soybeans.
Yeah.
And then corn's usually around the middle of November.
Believe it or not, that same time period also is true about fuel too. Is that same time period that's a low, traditional low for soybeans, is also close to the traditional low for fuel for the year.
Again, this year is definitely not traditional for sure, but there isn't any reason for this market to go down. USDA did lower demand, but the demand did not offset the difference in the yield. So
what's the basis doing right now?
Basis has continued to widen out, and I don't know what it's done since this report come out, but the basis was widening out, okay. Which means that the majors, the big boys, think that prices are going down.
Okay, well, those are things to watch. So still some fireworks left yet in this market.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, I know that you've actually I saw it on it's forwarded to me on a social media post about soybeans turning yellow, and what would cause a soybean to turn yellow this time of year?
Well, there's lots of things that can cause soybeans to turn yellow. We kind of had an episode about it probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, if you wanted to check that out. Real broadly speaking, right now Iowa State put an article out on Friday about there's some areas that are excessively wet we've talked about, that they think we're potentially seeing nitrogen deficiency from compromised root systems not having enough aeration to those roots, so they're not able to pull the moisture up and the nutrients up that they need, and they don't have the nodule formulation correct at that point yet. The next big one that's probably the big kicker for yellow soybeans in some of these drier areas is the bean plant is actually going into survival mode, and it could start senescence, which is physiological maturity. It doesn't have enough moisture. The plant doesn't think it has enough moisture to finish filling out. So those are the two big, broad, sweeping talks about yellow soybeans. But they're also in pocketed areas we are starting to see some disease show up. So in our northern climate, we kind of wanted to touch just a little bit on white mold. The best protection that you can get from that white mold, Turk, why don't you hit on just a little bit about your control strategies that you've seen work. You know, you have the mushrooms, like what's the time frame, how do you spray, you know.
But start at the beginning, you know, what causes white mold? The overwintering Sclerotinia, right?
Yeah, rat turds.
Because when you, that's what it's called. When you harvest your soybeans and you take a look at the sample and you see these little, what look like rat turds, it's actually the Sclerotinia of the fungi. It's actually in the core of the plant, and then it shatters and breaks up, and it looks like little pieces of charcoal, right?
Yep.
Take it from there.
Just like you said, Joe. So yeah, Ben, the white mold, it comes from the Sclerotinia that is in the field. Once you have it in the field, you're not going to get rid of it. There are some sprays that you can go out there that cost about $35 an acre if you can isolate those areas. But the issue is that once you have it in the field, it's probably there. You can't get rid of it. Your combine's already spread it across the landscape, so to speak. But the control mechanisms that I like to use, again, if you're not going to spray, and that spray has to be done right at flowering when the mushrooms are out there. It's R1 is when the white mold infects the plant right at flowering, because the mushrooms grow up from the Sclerotinia that cause the spores to go out. They get in the flower, and then that's when the white mold starts actually growing at R1.
So it's kind of like a jungle type environment, isn't it? I mean, you know, you think about fungi or mushrooms, it's got to be really wet and stay wet. In other words, the plant never, particularly if you got wide row or narrow rows.
Narrow rows, and so the narrow rows, when you get that canopy and it stays tropical climate down here, the best thing you can do is cut your population back, wider rows, and let some airflow get moving through there. So it's a fine line between canopy and air movement through there. But that's really the best. What my recommendation is to cut your population back and widen your rows out a little bit if you're experiencing a lot of white mold.
So the fungi literally spray the spores up into the air, and then they enter into the flower and get inside the pith of the plant, and that's where that charcoal or whatever, you know, the Sclerotinia,
mouse turds,
whatever you want to call it. And then when your combine goes and chews it all up, spreads it out over the field.
When you're looking at your sample to fall, if you see any little anything in the sample that looks like mouse turds, that's probably you've got some white mold in there. I have seen white mold clear down into Missouri on certain years, but it's usually something that the northern area of our northern footprint experiences.
And that brings you back to variety selection. If you're not careful, in other words, if you know you got a field, and you know when you rotate the corn and go back to it, it's still there. So then if you're planting group 3 varieties, you better look at that white mold score, because like you say, it's normally a group 2 and earlier type problem. So if you see it in your field, you better be thinking about it, because you can actually manage it with soybean varieties that have resistance or high levels of tolerance.
That helps a lot, and we do have varieties that are very, very good.
The new Chippewa.
Yep.
The new Chippewa is extremely effective. The Mercuries are extremely effective. They've gone standout. So a unique thing that we do here at Merschman's is we take our breeding notes from our launch year, and then we go back every year and update our scores throughout every year that product is in the lineup. Not all companies do that. They run off of just their launch year results, and we had products like, I can go for example, our 1.7 maturity on the Enlist side went from like a 7 to a 5.5. So
the reason for that is some years you just don't have the disease, and you can't get good scores. The more problems you have, the better scoring that we get.
Yep, we get that with sudden death, we get it with white mold, we get it with charcoal rot. You know, you have to have the disease present, so the breeders do their best job, but on a heavy pressure year, it really weeds out some of the problems, and that's why we make sure that we update our books to make sure that farmers are making the correct decisions.
So a bad situation turns out to be a good situation for the future. We're launching products.
Yep.
So basically, to recap, couple seconds here. So with white mold, if you have it out in the field, the most effective thing to do is find the fungicides, in my opinion, with the most efficacy, and make sure you're getting them sprayed at R1. I think one of the reasons we're going to see a lot of issues with white mold this year is because they were so dry. Farmers weren't sure if they were going to put the input on it, and I think that's kind of biting people in the butt now because we're too late in the game to be protecting those flowers.
You can't manage it now. No.
Yep. You talked about soybean selection. You talked about soybean selection is a huge deal. Those two are probably the most two important things, but their cultural practices, widening the rows, lowering the plant population, and allowing more airflow to get through the canopy. Those are all cultural practices that can do to help, but the two main things are the first two. The next disease that I wanted to talk about kind of affects us in southeast Iowa, northern Missouri, and as we move south, is Phytophthora. So we've had quite a bit of moisture over the past, give or take. I mean, here it rains every week, but we're starting to see Phytophthora, stem canker, some of these later season diseases kick in, and I kind of wanted to talk about all things Phytophthora, kind of like we did with the white mold. So what are the things that we can do? What are the different times that Phytophthora affect a soybean plant? We have seedling time frame, and the seedling time frame is mostly how we manage seedling Phytophthora is our seed treatment. You know, we have metalaxyl and ethoboxam. We have two overlapping modes of action for 2020. That gets the soybeans out of the ground, and that protects us from both Pythium and Phytophthora for soybean dampening off.
And we're noticing that Phytophthora and Pythium are becoming more of a problem. So therefore, we changed our seed treatment for 2022 and basically put two modes of action against those two diseases.
Yep. And I think I know we have an extremely a product that's got great efficacy against both of those water molds. As we get later into the season, Phytophthora can affect plants that are blooming, plants that are setting pods this time of year. We can see it in areas of saturated water conditions and areas where surface water runs. Most typically, we don't see it in big patches. We see it where that surface water or a ponding area can happen, because Phytophthora actually has it's a fungi that has a little tail called a flagella on the back of it, and it actually has to have saturated soil conditions for that tail to swim from place to place. And soybean roots actually exudates. They release exudates that attract the Phytophthora to that soybean plant, and an infection can happen very, very quickly. So what do we do about that?
So you got to have a lot of free water.
Yep.
And so if you don't have saturated soils, you're not going to get Phytophthora.
Correct.
So because if they can't swim, can't find the roots.
Correct.
And I've seen where it can hit one plant here, and the next plant next to it can be perfectly healthy, and then two dead plants, and then another healthy plant. And it's a little bit random based on the ability to swim to that plant.
Correct. So what do we do about it at this point in time in the season? Well, we have race-specific resistances that are our RPS genes, and that is the 1A, the 1C, the 3A, the 1K, and a lot of public varieties have the 6. I think it's the 6A. We see as public varieties get stuff, a lot of the times eventually within the next 3, 4, 5 years, the breeding companies will start working with these products that are publicly made, but it's just not real common right now to have the 6. The 1A and the 1C have been basically not in areas of high Phytophthora pressure. The efficacy oftentimes falls short.
This whole Phytophthora thing is literally have grown up with it, because it used to be race 1 was the only race we had.
Yep.
And now we're in the 20s, aren't we? I think there's something like that. So there's a lot of races. So the breeders are constantly chasing the new races, just like weed resistance. I mean, we're getting a selection process and a development process that changes, and so a farmer has to pay attention to his drainage and all the things that can encourage compaction, can encourage Phytophthora. We got these genetic resistance products, and then we also have field tolerance.
Correct. Yep. So you were talking. So the 1A is the original gene that was identified in the 1950s, late late 50s, early 60s, and you said it was resistant to the one gene. Well, as the lineage of these genes happen, they control more races. 1K is probably the most widespread gene that we have in the industry and in our lineup for that matter. It is handling things pretty well right now, but there are races that are becoming resistant to that, and they are affecting stands in that direction. 3A is probably the most effective Phytophthora gene that we have, and the Austin would be a good example in that southern market. Basically from here going south, the Austin has the 3A, and it should handle things very well.
So if you got a wet field,
yep.
Austin.
Yep. So when I talk to growers, and then you talk about field tolerances, when I talk to growers, if you know that Phytophthora is an issue, and you're working in the mid group 3s, and we have a Kennedy that is field tolerance, has a high level of field tolerance. We have a Monroe that has a 1K gene, and we have an Eisenhower that's got a decent level of field tolerance as well. If you know that you have Phytophthora as an issue, and it's been something that you worry about, I always go with the 1K. Unless you've grown Kennedys in similar circumstances where they've had water running over them and they handle things just fine, lean towards that 1K gene. You know, that's just an extra layer of protection from what you have. The field tolerances are advantageous because they have a tendency to handle all races, and they just have some level of genetic ability to handle the Phytophthora without knocking it out. But if there's certain genes and certain pressure levels out in the field, the 1K and the 3A are probably your better bet.
Yeah, and you have to realize that when you look at a field tolerant product versus a specific race resistant product, our seed treatment, like you said, like we talked about, will give you seedling protection from Phytophthora for 2 to 3 weeks. In other words, we put enough fungicide on that seed that we can protect it from most infections for 2 to 3 weeks. And if you can get it through the soybean out of the ground, field tolerance, the taller the plant grows, the more resistance, or not really resistance, but the more tolerance it has to Phytophthora. So field tolerance, I've seen varieties with specific race resistance die and then have field tolerance right next to it, doing well.
With no specific
gene.
Yeah,
no specific gene, because having a little bit where you have all your eggs in your one basket when you do like a 1A or 1C. I mean, you've got this resistance to these races, and all the rest of them you have susceptibility. Where the tolerance has a little bit of tolerance to all the way across. So I agree totally with what you say, Ben. If you know you're going to have a wet field, stays wet, go K, go 3A if you can.
Yep.
And then our seed treatment. I know that some folks have their seed treated downstream, but we really have a superior product now when it comes to both Pythium and Phytophthora seedling protection. And it's one of the things we do. I mean, we're looking at the limiting factor all the time. In other words, if anybody sends any kind of problem to us, we look into it, we follow up on it, and then we find out what exactly happened. Yep. That brings us to the next piece. What's that?
The next piece is identifying what that problem is. So in this individual example, that kind of what we're talking about, where we were getting pictures and why we're talking about Phytophthora on Cup of Joe, is what else could it be? So in the individual picture that I had, it looks like a fairly widespread area of the field. Stem canker is huge. So if you're running early varieties that don't have stem canker resistance, a lot of the time that stem canker can be the factor that is causing defoliation, yellowing in the canopy. Soybean cyst nematode affects circular, broad areas out in the field where we have high levels of cyst nematode. But more likely than not, when you're looking at the pictures that we've looked at, it's either probably stem canker or Phytophthora, and we really need to be paying attention, because if you don't have stem canker, a decent amount of Phytophthora resistance, whether it be gene or field tolerance, or frog eye in an early group 3, it's really not a product that travels south well.
Yeah, it's our southern folks that we're really talking to when we talk about stem canker. I mean, as a general rule, I've seen stem canker here in West Point, very rarely. I mean, for the most part, we don't have a problem, and as you go north, you don't see it. But frog eye, we occasionally get it in southern Iowa, and farther north, it depends upon how the spores blow up from down south. So, if I know we got a lot of farmers that like to plant early beans down south, and they've been very successful with the yields. But you've got to look at stem canker, you got to look at frog eye, you got to look at Phytophthora, or you could be setting yourself up for something that you're not wanting, and that's to have a disease come in and cut you short on your yield. So those are all things we're willing to talk about. And the other thing too is, when you have a problem, you really need to send those plants into a university specialist, have them what they call plate the disease, and positively identify what your enemy is, okay?
Yep.
Because I've personally gone out with agronomists and go, oh, it's Phytophthora, and we send it in, it comes back stem canker.
Yep. So what are you doing when you're pulling those diseases? You're looking for plants that aren't completely dead, because you get so much saprophytic fungi that they won't be able to plate it. They won't be able to identify and isolate the disease that you're looking at. So you're looking for a green plant that's on its way. You never pick those plants on a Friday. You always pick them on a Monday or a Tuesday, get them sent overnight in the mail, or drive them to your local pathologist that you're going to be having them taken. And if you really want to go above and beyond and figure out what races of Phytophthora, if that is indeed what you have, you can take soil samples. And I know Michigan State University does it. I'm not sure if Iowa State or Carbondale do but they can actually take about a gallon of your soil. You want to take 5-inch cores right in the root zone, and they will be able to tell you what races that you have out in that field.
So then you can specifically pick a soybean with a resistance to that race.
Yep.
So very good discussion.
Yep. So we got some disease for the northern folks, some disease for the southern folks that we can talk about. And
Ben,
what are you thinking about next year?
When soybeans were introduced into the United States, they were considered a disease-free crop back in the day. That's all changed, hasn't it? That's why everybody says, that old soybean I used to have, I wish they never discontinued it. Well, I can guarantee you, if we were planting soybeans that are 30 years old today, they would just die, because we didn't have as much cyst, and we didn't have all these things going on. So that's why when you sit down with your Merschman representative to talk about seed, don't chase the most popular variety. Talk about your fields, talk about your drainage, what's your disease cycles. Those things are all critical, because, like they say in the sports, defense wins championships, and in many cases it's the same thing with soybeans and corn too.
The right variety for the right field.
That's right. Pay attention to that, because that'll make you more money than anything you do. Saving $1 or $2 on a bag of soybeans, pay more attention to selecting the right product for the field. Well, I did a really poor job last week on my corny jokes.
Did you get some mail?
Yeah, I got some hate mail. I mean, it was really, but hey, I had it coming, so I took it. Well, Dave O'Hara, Dave O'Hara Sports, and he does a statewide show called The Hawkeyed. He gave me one of the ones that was a little bit tough. He said he wanted a chance to redeem himself. So this week he gave me one, and I think you'll see if, don't you think, this might be a little bit better, okay? So Dave, you're going to either live or die based on this one here, okay? How do you row a canoe filled with puppies? How do you row a canoe filled with puppies? Dog paddle, okay? That's better. I think that was okay. I heard a little bit of a chuckle there. Now, my brother George, trying to help me out, he lives down at Springfield, Illinois. So he sent me one last night. And of course, this would only be for Illinois folks, okay? This particular joke, because it's legal over there, okay? A couple of cows were smoking a joint and playing poker. That's right. The stakes were pretty high.
George.
Oh, well, we tried. As always, we thank you for your business. We hope you and your family are safe, and we'll see you next week. Take care.